There is a photograph that has been passed around the darker corners of the internet for years now. A tall mirror in a heavy gilded frame, its surface clouded and silver grey, the glass spotted with black bloom-like ink, soaking through paper. The story attached to it is always the same. A slave trader in the American South kept this mirror locked in a sealed room. He never let anyone look into it. And in 1857, in the last letter he ever wrote to his wife, he begged her to keep it covered, keep it shut away, and never sell it. The people who share this image will tell you the mirror was made before 1830. They will tell you that matters. They will tell you that a clear, perfect mirror could not exist in that decade, that the technology had not arrived yet, and so this object is proof of something. Proof of a vanished civilization. Proof of a world that was erased and rewritten. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Proof, they say, of Tartaria. It is a haunting little story. The locked room, the dying man, the thing in the glass he could not bear to face. But here is what nobody sharing that photo wants to slow down and admit. The real history of that mirror is darker than the myth. It is better documented than the myth. And it points to a fortune built on something far more disturbing than a lost empire. To understand why a man in 1857 would lock a mirror away and write about it on his deathbed, you do not need a hidden civilization. You need to follow the money, and the money leads somewhere people would much rather not look. Let me show you what was actually in that glass. Start with the object itself, because almost everything the conspiracy crowd says about it is built on one simple misunderstanding. They believe a flawless mirror could not be made before the 1830s. That belief is the entire foundation of the theory, and it is wrong by about 300 years. The kind of mirror in that photograph is called a tin mercury amalgam mirror. The method behind it is old, genuinely old. Craftsmen were backing glass with a tin and mercury coating in the 1400s, and by 1507 the technique had a home. That year, two brothers named Dalgallo bought a 20-year privilege to manufacture mercury mirrors on the island of Murano, just across the water from Venice. That is not a typo. 1507. A working, gleaming, high-quality mirror industry existed more than 500 years ago. The process was strange and beautiful and quietly poisonous. A worker would lay a thin sheet of tin foil flat, then pour liquid mercury across it until the metal dissolved into a shimmering silver paste. Then they pressed a sheet of clear glass down onto that paste, slowly squeezing out the excess, until the amalgam bonded to the back of the glass. What you got was a reflection sharper and brighter than anything humans had ever seen of themselves before. For most of human history, a person caught their reflection in polished bronze, in still water, in a dim sheet of hammered silver. Then Venice learned to trap light in glass, and suddenly a wealthy person could see their own face, in full, in perfect colour, looking back. You can imagine what that did to people, but you should also know what it did to the men who made these mirrors, because that part rarely makes it into the story. Mercury is a poison. The workers breathed its vapour for hours every day, hunched over the amalgam in poorly ventilated workshops, and it destroyed them. It attacked their nerves and their minds. They trembled, their teeth fell out, they lost control of their own movements and slid into confusion and madness. There is a phrase from that world for the condition, a kind of mercury sickness, and it shadowed the entire trade for centuries. The beautiful object that let the rich admire themselves was, on the other side of the glass, slowly killing the poor. Hold on to that, because it is the pattern that runs through this whole story. The luxury was always real. So was the price somebody else paid for it. These mirrors were not decoration. They were power. Venice guarded the method like a state secret, and for roughly a century to a century and a half the city held a near total monopoly on the finest glass mirrors in the world. They were worth more than paintings by famous masters. A large Venetian mirror could cost as much as a sailing ship. And there is one detail from the late 1600s that tells you everything about how the rich saw these objects. A French countess, the Countess de Fiesque, reportedly traded an entire wheat farm for a single mirror. An entire farm, land, harvest, future income, all of it, gone in exchange for a slab of reflective glass. And by her own account, she thought she got the better end of the deal. That kind of value turns an object into a weapon of state. And the story of how the monopoly broke reads like a thriller. By the 1660s, France was bleeding fortunes into Venice every year just to buy mirrors for its palaces. Louis XIV's finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, decided to end that. He sent agents to Murano to secretly lure away Venetian glassworkers, smuggling them out of the city and into Paris to spill the secret. Venice did not take this quietly. The Venetian authorities threw the families of the defectors into prison to force them home. And when that failed, according to the accounts that survive, they sent assassins after the runaway craftsmen to silence them for good. Men died over the recipe for a mirror, but Colbert won. French workshops cracked the method. The great hall of mirrors at Versailles went up gleaming with hundreds of panes, and the age of the Venetian monopoly was over. So when someone online tells you a perfect mirror could not have existed before 1830, understand what they are actually claiming. They are claiming that 3.5 centuries of documented craftsmanship, a guarded trade secret that built fortunes, an industry so valuable that kings committed espionage, and a republic committed murder to control it, simply did not happen. The mirror in the photo is not evidence of a lost civilization. It is evidence of the one we already know about, a civilization that turned vanity into an industry, and that industry into empire. But this raises the obvious question. If these mirrors existed for centuries, why does the year 1830 keep coming up? Why do the theorists fixate on that exact decade? Here is where they take a real fact and twist it. Something genuinely did change around 1835. A German chemist named Justus von Liebig worked out how to coat glass with a thin layer of metallic silver using a chemical reaction. This was the birth of the modern mirror, the silvered mirror, the kind hanging in your bathroom right now. It was cheaper, it was safer, it could be mass-produced, and over the following decades it slowly pushed the old mercury method out of business, until manufacturing mercury mirrors was finally banned in 1886 because the fumes were killing the workers who made them. So there is a real dividing line in mirror history. Before the 1830s, the luxury mirror was a mercury mirror. After the silvered mirror gradually took over, the theorists grab that line and run in exactly the wrong direction. They say a clear mirror before 1830 is impossible. The truth is the opposite. Before 1830, a clear mirror simply meant you were rich enough to afford the older, deadlier, more expensive kind. The date does not prove the mirror is impossible. It proves the owner had money, serious money, and that is the thread we are going to pull. Because the man in the story, the man who locked the mirror away in 1857, was the kind of person who had exactly that money. The question is where it came from. To answer that, we have to leave the glassworks of Venice and travel to the American South in the years just before the Civil War. And we have to talk about a business that the comfortable version of history likes to keep in soft focus. In the decades between 1820 and 1860, white traders in the United States bought and sold more than 1 million human beings inside the country itself. This was the domestic slave trade, and by the 1850s it was one of the most profitable enterprises in America. It worked like a supply chain. States like Virginia, where the soil was tiring and the old tobacco economy was fading, turned to selling people as a cash crop. Human beings were raised, valued, and shipped south, marched overland in chained columns called coffles, or packed below the decks of coastal ships, down to the booming cotton and sugar lands of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The machinery of it was cold and orderly. which is somehow the worst part. Traders kept holding pens, sometimes right in the middle of respectable cities, where the people they had purchased were locked up and fed and inspected like livestock until a buyer arrived. There were bills of sale, there were receipts, there were printed price lists and newspaper advertisements and insurance policies. New Orleans held the largest slave market in the country, and whole city blocks they were given over to the buying and selling of people. This was not a fringe activity carried out in shadows. It was a normal public paperwork-heavy industry with offices and clerks and respectable men in good coats. Historians have a name for this forced migration. They call it the Second Middle Passage, an echo of the original Atlantic crossing, because in scale and cruelty it was a second uprooting of an entire people. Roughly 1 million men, women and children were torn out of the Upper South and driven into the Deep South over those decades. Families were split apart on the auction block as a matter of routine. Husbands sold away from wives, children sold away from mothers, sometimes while she watched. The traders did not see tragedy in this. They saw inventory moving to where it would fetch the best price. And the men who ran that traffic, the men who organized the coffles and filled the pens and signed the bills of sale, were not outcasts. The most successful of them were wealthy, connected and respected, and they spent their profits the way the rich always do. I want you to sit with the numbers, because the numbers are how the men of that era thought about it. In the 1850s, a healthy young enslaved man could be sold for around $1,000. In today's money, that is somewhere near $30,000. A trader who moved 10 such people in a single transaction was handling the equivalent of $250,000 in modern terms, and the demand kept climbing through the decade, which meant prices climbed too. Slave trading in the 1850s was not a sideline. For the men who specialized in it, it was a fortune machine that ran on human lives. This is the world our mirror owner lived in. Not a mystical empire wiped from the maps. A real, bloody, ledger-driven economy where a man could become rich by turning other human beings into line items. And once a man got rich that way, he wanted everyone to see it. That desire is the next piece of the puzzle, because the slave economy did not just produce wealth. It produced a very particular hunger to display that wealth. As cotton prices rose and the largest planters swallowed up their weaker neighbors, a new class of enormously rich southern families emerged. And they had something to prove. They were not old aristocrats with centuries of lineage. Many of them were a single generation removed from rough farmhouses and muddy boots. So they did what newly rich people have always done. They built. Across Alabama, Louisiana, and the Mississippi Delta, the plain farmhouses of an earlier generation were torn down and replaced with enormous, ostentatious mansions. Natchez, Charleston, New Orleans, the great houses went up one after another, each grander than the last, each one a brick and marble argument that its owner belonged at the top of the world. And here is the detail that matters for our story. Almost nothing inside those mansions was made in the South. The carpets, the lamps, the dinnerware, the upholstered furniture, the books, the musical instruments, all the trappings of refined living came from the North or from Europe. The South grew the cotton and sold the people. It imported the comfort. A planter who wanted to look civilized filled his home with goods shipped in from somewhere else, often on credit, often pushing himself deep into debt to keep up appearances. The wealth looked solid and permanent. Underneath, much of it was borrowed, leveraged and balanced on the next good harvest and the next sale. So picture what a fine mirror meant inside one of those houses. It was not just glass, it was a statement. A large, imported, expensive mirror in a gilded frame announced to every guest who walked through the door that this family had arrived, that they could afford the finest object in the room, that their money, however it was made, could buy the same luxury that European countesses once traded farms for. The mirror that had symbolized power in the palaces of Venice and Versailles now did the same job in a mansion built on a cotton field worked by people in chains. Now you can see the shape of the real story forming. A slave trader, grown rich on the buying and selling of human beings. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Furnishing a mansion to broadcast that wealth, importing a luxury mirror of exactly the kind that had meant money and power for 3 centuries. There is no mystery about how such a mirror came to hang in such a house. It came the way everything in that house came, bought with the profits of an unspeakable trade. There is a grim symmetry worth pausing on. A mirror like this would have crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a ship, packed in straw, insured against breakage, treated as precious cargo on the same ocean that the original slave ships had crossed, carrying a very different kind of cargo a generation or 2 before. The luxury sailed one way. The suffering that paid for it pointed the other way. By the 1850s, those 2 currents had braided together so tightly that nobody in that mansion would have thought to separate them. The mirror on the wall and the people in the fields were entries in the same account book, kept by the same hand, in the same steady, untroubled ink. And the year on the letter, 1857, is not a random date either. It happens to land on one of the most revealing moments in American economic history. In August of that year, a major financial firm collapsed and panic ripped through the banks of the North. Businesses failed by the thousands. Railroads went bankrupt. Workers were thrown out into the cold of winter. It became known as the Panic of 1857, and it is remembered as one of the first truly global financial crises. But here is the twist that mattered to a Southern slaveholder. The South rode it out far better than the North. Cotton prices dipped and then recovered, and Southern men took that as proof that their system, the system built on slavery, was stronger and safer than the free labor economy up north. So imagine a wealthy slave trader writing to his wife in that exact year. The financial world is shaking. Northern fortunes are evaporating overnight. And he is sitting on his assets, his land, his human property, and his valuable imported possessions, thinking hard about what to protect and what to preserve. A letter from a dying man in 1857 telling his wife to guard a rare and costly object is not a message from beyond. It is a man doing exactly what frightened rich men do when the ground feels unstable. He is securing the estate. But what about the locked room? What about the covered glass and the plea never to sell it? Even if we strip away the Tartaria fantasy, that part of the story still has a grip on people. So let us deal with it honestly. Start with the mirror itself, because a mercury mirror is a genuinely unsettling object to live with, and not for any supernatural reason. The amalgam on the back is not stable. It is a living, shifting material caught forever between liquid and solid. Over the years, the mercury slowly migrates. It pools. It weeps down toward the bottom of the frame. The reflective surface clouds and crystallizes and grows dark blooms, those black spreading stains you see in old mirrors as the coating decays. Conservators who handle these mirrors today are warned never to tilt or flip them, because moving them can send the trapped liquid mercury flooding into the dried out areas and ruin the surface in unpredictable ways. So imagine owning one of these in 1857, a mirror that was already old, a mirror that had to be kept upright, kept still, kept undisturbed, or it would destroy itself. A mirror slowly going dark from the inside, its reflection dimming and spotting year after year for reasons nobody at the time fully understood. A practical man with a valuable, fragile, decaying mirror would absolutely keep it locked in a still room, covered, untouched, protected from the light and the heat and the careless hands of servants and children. Not because of a ghost, because the thing was worth a fortune and was falling apart, and he knew it. And the deathbed letter, the plea to keep it covered and never sell it. That is the most ordinary part of the whole story. We have countless real letters and wills from this era, planters and traders writing to their families about property, about debts, about which possessions to protect and which to part with. A dying man instructing his wife on how to handle a rare, fragile, valuable object is not eerie. It is estate planning. He was telling her how to preserve an asset, the same way he would have told her which debts to call in and which to settle. The myth takes a man protecting his investment and turns him into a man hiding a portal. It takes mercury chemistry and turns it into the supernatural. It takes the most mundane explanation, money, and replaces it with the most extraordinary one, a hidden world. And it does that for a reason. Because the truth, the real truth about where that money came from, is something a lot of people would genuinely rather not think about. The fantasy is more comfortable than the receipt. This brings us to the strangest part of the whole phenomenon. Why does any of this attach to a story about a lost empire in the first place? Where does Tartaria even come from? The answer is messier and more recent than its followers like to admit. The modern Tartaria theory did not come down from ancient records. It was assembled piece by piece over the last few decades. The name itself is real but mundane. Tartary or Tartaria was simply an old, broad European label for the vast stretch of Central Asia and Siberia, a catch-all term mapmakers used for a region the West knew little about. There were real maps, real places, real peoples. None of it was secret. The conspiracy version has a traceable origin, and it begins in Russia. In the 1970s and 1980s, a Russian mathematician named Anatoly Fomenko built an elaborate alternative timeline he called the New Chronology, arguing that huge stretches of recorded history were faked and that thousands of years had been invented and added to the human story. It was nonsense, rejected by every working historian, but it planted a seed. Then a Russian occultist named Nikolai Levashov took those ideas and gave them a nationalist, mystical spin, recasting Tartaria as the suppressed true name of a great lost Russian civilization. The Russian Geographical Society, the country's own official body of geographers, looked at these claims and flatly called them an extremist fantasy. That is the soil the theory grew in. Russian pseudo-history and occult nationalism. It sat in those circles for years. Then, around 2016 and 2017, something shifted. The idea jumped onto English-language YouTube and Reddit and Facebook, and as it crossed over, it mutated. It dropped most of its Russian framing and became something new, an architectural conspiracy. A theory about buildings. In this new internet version, the claim is that the world's grand old architecture, the ornate train stations, the world's fair pavilions, the domed capitals and cathedrals, was too beautiful and too advanced to have been built by the people of the 1800s and 1900s. So the theory goes, it must be the surviving wreckage of a forgotten global super-civilization, an empire of breathtaking buildings and free wireless energy, wiped from memory and stolen from us. One critic gave it the perfect nickname. He called it the QAnon of architecture. And how, supposedly, was this magnificent empire destroyed and hidden? Here the theory reaches for two ideas. The first is the great cover-up, the claim that the world's governments and historians conspired to rewrite every record and erase every trace. The second is stranger and more specific, the mud flood. Believers point to old buildings whose basement windows and lower doorways sit partly below the current street level, and they say this is proof that a sudden global wave of mud once buried the bottom floors of an entire civilization. The real explanations are far less dramatic and far better supported. Cities were regraded constantly in the 1800s. Streets were raised, paved, and built up over decades. As one architectural historian put it, much of what looks like mysterious sediment can be explained by the sheer filth of the horse-powered city, the mud and the muck of a world that ran on hooves. Buildings on sloped ground naturally sit lower on one side. World's fair pavilions were built to be torn down within months, which is exactly why so few survive. And the grand architecture was not beyond the people of the era at all. We have the blueprints, we have the construction photographs, we have the payrolls, the contracts, the names of the architects and the labourers. The buildings were difficult and expensive and astonishing, and ordinary 19th century human beings built them anyway. That is the actual marvel. So why does a debunked architectural fantasy keep reaching out to grab objects like our mirror? Because the theory needs evidence, and a mercury mirror is the perfect false witness. It looks ancient. It is clouded and decaying in a way that feels otherworldly. Its real history is unfamiliar to most people, and it carries that magic dividing line, the year 1830, that lets a theorist say, see, this could not have been made by the world we are told existed. A strange, beautiful, poorly understood object is exactly the kind of raw material a conspiracy feeds on. The myth does not survive on lost empires. It survives on borrowed mystery, taken from real things whose true stories were simply never explained to the people staring at them. It is worth being honest about why the theory pulls people in, because the pull is real and it is not stupid. It starts from a few true and very human feelings, a deep distrust of official institutions which have in fact lied to people plenty of times, a genuine sense of wonder standing in front of a vast old building, wondering how human hands ever made such a thing, and a quiet suspicion that history, as it is handed to us, was written by the powerful to flatter themselves. Those instincts are not crazy. The trouble is where the theory takes them. It answers a real feeling with a fake fact. It takes the legitimate awe and the legitimate distrust and pours them into a story with no evidence, no primary sources, and no coherent account of who did the erasing or how. It feels like rebellion against the official story. In practice, it just replaces a documented history with an invented one that happens to require no homework. And that, in the end, is the part worth sitting with, because there is a real erasure in this story. There genuinely is a hidden history behind that mirror, a truth that got buried and smoothed over and left out of the comfortable version. But it is not the loss of a magical empire. What got erased is the labour. The luxury of the old world, the Venetian glass that cost a wheat farm, the mirrors the men of Murano poisoned themselves to make, the gilded frames in the Natchez mansions, the carpets and the chandeliers and the imported comfort, all of it rested on the backs of people whose names were turned into prices. The mirror in that photograph, if it ever truly hung in a slave trader's house, did not reflect a lost civilization. It reflected the faces of a family grown rich on a trade in human lives, and it reflected every single day a man who could look at himself and feel nothing wrong. That is the thing he might not have wanted to face, not a portal, a reflection. The Tartaria story offers people a clean villain, a faceless cabal, a cover-up, a flood, something safely far away and impossible to feel guilty about. The real story offers something much harder. It says the grand and beautiful things of the past were often paid for in suffering that was deliberately written out of the picture, so that the wealth could be admired without the cost being remembered. The myth invents an erasure to distract from the real one. It is far easier to mourn an empire that never existed than to look squarely at the empire that did, the one with cotton in its fields and people in its ledgers. So the next time that clouded mirror drifts across your screen, with its locked room and its dying man and its whisper of a vanished world, you will know what you are actually looking at. Not the relic of Tartaria, not proof of a rewritten timeline. You are looking at a genuine artifact of a real and brutal economy. A luxury object, centuries of craftsmanship and centuries of poisoned workers behind it, bought with the profits of human beings sold by the head. The glass is going dark, not because it hides another world, but because the mercury behind it is dying, the way it always does, slowly, quietly, from the inside. A lost empire asks nothing of you. You can scroll past it, share it, marvel at it, and feel only a pleasant chill. A real history of stolen labour and sold children asks something harder. It asks you to hold the beautiful object and the ugly cost in the same hand at the same time, and not let go of either one. That is the whole reason the comfortable version keeps winning out. It lets the wealth stay beautiful by quietly cropping the people who paid for it out of the frame. The man wanted it kept covered. Maybe that was about money, about protecting one more valuable thing as the financial world trembled around him. Maybe in some small and buried part of him, it was about not wanting to be looked at by the only witness in the house that never lied. Either way, the story he left behind is not the one being told online. The real one was never lost. It was just easier to look away from. And a covered mirror, after all, is only ever hiding the person standing in front of it.